Warm weather, sandy beaches, and just a little bit of revolution to go around. We're taking a quick peek at Tropico 6. The Tropico series is one that's been around for a long time. After all, we're going to be talking about the 6th installment here. For those unaware, it's a game about city building and political management. While many other titles tend to focus on one or the other, Tropico has players look inward to their own country's economic and overall happiness, opposed to strictly building infrastructure or managing armies for global domination. Unless you're playing a multiplayer game, but that's something we'll get into a little bit later on. Players take on the role of El Presidente, who is definitely not Fidel Castro, and put in charge of the Caribbean island country of Tropico, which is definitely not Cuba, I swear to you. You've got two basic goals: stay in power and don't rack up too much debt. Losing an election or being forcefully removed from power is game over, so you've got to keep your people happy on at least some level, or at least have a powerful enough military to keep them at bay. Either one costs money for constructing buildings, building upkeep, and keeping whichever edicts running that you want. Money going out means you need money going in, which means more things to pay for and the possibility of going deeper and deeper into debt. Balancing building and maintaining a strong economy while providing citizens with basic services like housing and healthcare to keep them happy enough to not want to murder you is what Tropico is all about.
I have good news and bad news. The good news is you set a record. The bad news is that it is for runaway national debt.
While the series started in 2001 with developer Pop Top Software and publisher Take-Two Interactive, it's gone through quite a few studios over the years. In 2008, Calypso grabbed the rights to captain the franchise and tasked Hemot Games, whose name I hope I'm saying at least somewhat correctly, with developing and expanding the series with Tropico 3, 4, and 5. Once again, the ship's crew has changed, as Tropico 6 was put together by Limbic Entertainment, a company that's mostly worked on Ubisoft's Heroes of Might and Magic series, and only being able to really reach a mixed reception with their releases. Each new game that bears the Tropico name always brings something different to change things up, but many times it feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Tropico 3 brought the series up to date with full 3D graphics, even though it sometimes has trouble running those graphics at a stable frame rate, or even just running at all. 4 introduced new buildings and the quick build option for construction, as well as a ministry, requiring players to hire ministers in order to issue specific edicts, along with faction leaders who will give you different tasks for helpful rewards and even some natural disasters to worry about. 5 changed things up the most with the introduction of a Dynasty System that expands the family line of El Presidente, along with adding the functionality to select building managers, buildings with edicts that unlock through a research tree, and one of the biggest changes to the series overall, different eras. Each game tried to advance the series, but it really felt like Himamot didn't really know what to do, and just kinda threw things at the wall hoping something would stick. While 3 was a nice take on the original games, 4's ministry seemed annoying to keep on top of, since you had to have specific ministers in order to do specific things. In order to have a literacy program, you had to have a Minister of Education, which meant either hiring one from overseas or hoping you had a citizen with the proper requirements for the position. Industrial buildings need high school educated workers, and the literacy program helps citizens learn faster in high schools to give you more workers for those kinds of jobs. 5 had even more quality of life improvements, and while being able to appoint managers who could cause different effects to take place in the things they managed was interesting, it was one of those fire and forget things where you'd appoint somebody and then never look at it again. The Dynasty System also felt rather half-baked and made it so you could no longer select El Presidente individually to send around to different buildings in order to temporarily improve their efficiency. Eras are an interesting idea on paper, but what they really feel like is a limitation, as they restrict what buildings can be constructed and what edicts players can research or issue depending upon which era they are in. Eras go anywhere from Colonial to the Cold Wars, with Colonial being the most interesting since it changes up how you have to play the game. Instead of having to keep your subjects happy, you have to make the crown happy to extend your governor mandate, and keep the position of Governor of Tropico before declaring independence and then having to deal with elections. Eras also make things a bit odd with the character of El Presidente, since they now come off as some immortal leader who's able to stay both alive and in power for hundreds of years. Although, if you specifically wanted to, you could pick different members of your dynasty to elect and even retire them, though I never really found a reason to do that. 5 also had the odd addition of a fog of war effect where players would have to send out expedition parties in order to uncover natural resources so that they could actually use them, and it really felt overall unnecessary. The reason why I'm taking the time to talk about all of this is because when Limbic Entertainment took the reins of Tropico 6, they had to figure out what ideas and mechanics they would keep, change, or fully throw out from previous titles, as well as figuring out where they could take the series from how 5 left it. Limbic thankfully got rid of the odd fog of war mechanic that just seemed wholly unnecessary, while also removing the half-baked Dynasty System for a return to previous presidential control and election speeches, while keeping multiple eras to advance through and tweaking the ministry so it's not as much of a requirement as it used to be. They also added a whole host of new buildings like tunnels and bus stations for transportation or coconut harvesters for quick early resource to export or build upon later with industry buildings. Setting up a thriving economy is as important as ever and made a bit more strategic by the introduction of archipelago levels that give players multiple small islands to work with instead of one large landmass. Single island environments do still exist, but they mostly take a back seat to the new stuff. Islands can be connected by either bridges or different ports, depending upon what you want to use it for. Teamsters need either a bridge to drive over or a specific Teamster port in order to move resources around between resource-gathering buildings and industrial buildings that will turn them into something that can be exported at a dock. But general citizens can get away with using only a cheaper landing to get around. The era system does limit this quite a bit, as different types of transportation are limited to different eras, like bridges only being able to build from the World Wars era all the way up to modern times, but not being an option in colonial days. The biggest thing to keep in mind is how resources are spread around the islands you have to work with. Minerals for mining, forests for logging, coconuts for harvesting, as well as crop and livestock conditions vary throughout a level's map, meaning you'll have to find ways to adapt your industry not only for what may be available on a level-by-level basis, but also what you can get to in that level and how much you want to expand. This really comes into play through the game's single-player content.
Look left, look right. Statistically, every one of those people could be a spy. Be vigilant and report all strange activities, especially from family members.
Unlike previous games in the series, Tropico 6 forgoes an overarching campaign to instead focus on individual missions. I've read about many people disliking this change since they enjoyed seeing Tropico grow and constantly build upon itself, while they had to adapt what they'd already made in order to complete new level objectives. While I agree with this to a point, I do feel that a mission system works better with the game's current mechanics. Missions not only have their own level layouts with different archipelagos or land masses to deal with, but also challenge players with area restrictions or special role sets. One mission tasks players with growing their population on a well-connected desert island set in the Cold War era, forcing them to figure out how to keep everyone happy even though they can't build residential buildings, meaning the overall housing quality is constantly decreasing. Another mission gives players a cluster of small islands that are very light on natural resources, making them have to balance tourism with offshore oil platforms. The best thing about the era system is that it doesn't bombard players with tons of options all at once, but instead slowly expands what can be done over time. Not only do different eras give access to different buildings and edicts, but they also bring into account different world powers to contend with, as well as an ever-increasing amount of factions to keep satisfied. During colonial times, you only have to worry about pleasing the crown so you stay in charge, while balancing the royalist faction with revolutionaries. But as things progress, you'll have to deal with capitalists, environmentalists, industrialists, intellectuals, conservatives, the Axis and allies, Eastern and Western powers, and even China.
Don't be intimidated by the immense power of my country. You are still absolutely free to make the wrong choice and not help us.
Having to only deal with some of these things at a time in different missions really helps to gain an understanding of the inner workings for each subsection of the game, as well as how to build an economy and population to maximize what you have access to for each era, opposed to moving from one to the next without ever seeing it again. I will admit that it is kind of annoying to have to start from scratch for every new mission, but missions can be played in any order as long as they've been unlocked first. So if you're having a difficult time with one, you can always try another and come back later. Keeping with the trend, Tropico 6 brings in more quality of life and UI improvements, making it easier to find information such as expenses or revenue income, as well as individual citizen happiness and what is affecting current approval ratings with different factions or the general populace. The devs didn't stop there when it came to adding new things to the game. One of the funner features of Tropico 6 is the raid and heist system. 5 had something sort of like this with the espionage DLC, but 6 really takes the idea and runs with it. Each era has a raid building that can be constructed, from a pirate cove that can be sent out to steal loot to the return of the spy academy you can use for espionage against other countries. There's really no reason not to construct these buildings, as each one has their own unique actions they can complete in order to give you more tools to work with. These buildings produce and consume raid points, and while they're generally limited to only constructing one of each type, one of the most important things they can do is complete heists. Heists can take a long time to finish and require a good bit of resources to do, but they are generally worth it since they let you build world wonders, which have different bonus effects. Each raid building can only perform one heist, and there are multiple different wonders to choose from to steal, like the Roman Colosseum to the flippin' Statue of Liberty. Yeah, I'm sure no one's gonna notice that's missing from the New York Harbor. Each building you nab is important for the effects they offer and the amount of money you gotta put out to build the dang things in the first place. Something like Stonehenge will make forests constantly grow around it, which is good for propping up an industry built on logging, turning trees into logs, logs into planks, then planks into furniture of boats. Each step of the process not only makes more exports, but also exports of a higher quality to bring in more cash, so having something to bolster forestry is very useful. One of my go-to wonders is the Eastern Island Moai statue, since they make boats and cargo ships move faster, meaning resources get around quicker and import and exports happen more often. There's a good bit of strategy to what heists you want to do depending on how you're building your country, but remember, you still gotta have somewhere to put the wonder once you have it. With how Tropico 6 breaks up its landmass, I constantly found myself fighting with the age-old problem of building Tetris. Buildings have all kinds of different sizes to worry about, and trying to squeeze them into an area where they'll be the most effective isn't always easy on these small islands. only a handful of buildings can be relocated after they've been built, and I constantly found myself having to demolish and rebuild different things in an attempt to make everything fit just right. If you find yourself in a situation where the population is at your throat and you can't fit something like a fast food joint with a delivery upgrade into a residential area in order to increase the housing quality so you fulfill your last election promise, all is not lost. You can always try an image campaign. Previous Tropico games not only let you fill the palace treasury, also known as the Tropican economy, but also had the option to siphon off a bit from the top into El Presidente's own personal Swiss bank account. I never really found much of a reason to do this in the past, since many of the older games only use the Swiss bank account as a way of bolstering a player's score for each level. 5 tried something different by having it used to upgrade traits of Dynasty members, but now that the Dynasty system is gone, the devs for 6 had to figure out what else they were going to do with it. Now there's a character called the Broker that lets you use that Swiss cheese you've been hoarding for the past couple of years. Every now and then he'll pop up asking you to do something in exchange for some cheddar, which can then be spent on things like an image campaign to make people want to vote for you, stimulate trade to get new lists of imports and exports, or even purchase blueprints or research options right off the bat without having to wait to unlock them. Swiss bank money can also be traded for real cash, knowledge points, raid points, or educated immigrants, and I personally find it a fantastic addition to the franchise. High scores are something I never really cared about, especially for a city builder management kind of game like Tropico, so I never really did much in the way of stacking up money for the Swiss bank account, and while upgrading Dynasty members could be useful, it generally cost way too much money to do so to be worth it. Now that it can be used for stuff like getting out of debt because I just can't seem to help myself from using the quick build option when constructing buildings, I actively look for ways to get some cash flow for it. A good way to do that is through appointed ministers. Instead of the vague stats previous games gave for people who could be appointed to the ministry, candidates now are connected to different factions with bonuses going into effect when they are hired. An intellectual as the Minister of Education not only raises your standing with that faction, but also improves education through high schools, while someone you appoint who was suggested by the broker will send a few bits of cheddar your way every month. It makes who you select more important than just selecting someone in the first place, and gives the ministry a real purpose compared to the past. Tropico 6 does have its issues though, as everything always does. Laying out roads is as temperamental as it's always been, since they just don't want to connect to each other in a sensible way. Bridges, while a nice addition, can be a bit of a hassle, since they require a road to take up a few tiles of land before going across the water, while tunnels that make travel through mountains possible can be a real pain to find somewhere the game will actually let you place both ends of them. There's also no way to positively influence natural resources of a map. Building roads or constructing buildings clears the nearby area of trees, and once they're gone, even if whatever was built there is demolished. There's no way to replant a forest, and if you aren't careful, buildings like logging camps and coconut harvesters can become inactive due to the lack of nearby resources to work with. The game can also be a bit hit or miss when it comes to teamsters and if they actually want to move resources around or not. Logistics has never been super important to Tropico, with vehicles being more for show, as long as something's connected to a road, it's usually good to go. 6 doesn't do anything to deal with the problem of both cars and boats going through each other or making weird pathing decisions. Sometimes buildings will just sit there with their stocks full for long periods of time or run out of inventory to work with, even though there's a Teamster office and the materials they need right next to them. Immigration is also something I had a lot of issues with, since it seemed to happen way too fast. I don't know if I was just building an attractive country for everybody to move to, or if there's something wrong with the game, but I quickly found myself having to rely on an immigration office as fast as I could build one in order to stop my population from booming out of control. leaving hundreds of people homeless, without a job, unhappy, and not wanting to vote for me, which is the most important thing in the game. Multiplayer also leaves a lot to be desired. Tropico 5 introduced both cooperative and competitive multiplayer to the series, and while I never played it then, I did give it a bit of a try with 6. It's neat to see multiple cities spring up around a group of islands, and maps are broken up into specific spaces for each player's nation, which reminds me a bit of the Civilization games. There's many ways to customize a multiplayer game, such as picking the win state, but the only games I was able to get into were all about capturing outposts to expand your boundaries while conquering other players with the game's limited military mechanics. In single player, the military is only good for defending against either rebels or invading superpowers if you happen to make one of them rather upset with you, but in multiplayer you can send out squads to attack other players. Unfortunately, the downside is that Tropico 6 uses a player hosting system, and from my experience, whenever the host starts losing, they just leave the server, which ends the game right there, even if there's still other players present. There's no host migration or anything, and it's really annoying to get a nice economy going just for someone to leave and all that work go to waste. Multiplayer also has some limitations compared to single player, with no time manipulation options. You can't pause the game, which makes sense since it would mean you'd have to pause for every player, and that could get annoying. But there's also no way to speed things up. Multiplayer games are stuck on the base 1x speed permanently, which means it takes forever and a day to get anything done. Overall, I really enjoyed my time with Tropico 6, and I feel like it made many changes and improvements for the better. And multiplayer is kind of yeah, but I still had a good time regardless. There's just so many little improvements that make it easier to keep track of what's going on within the game, and with all the new features, it finally feels like the series has advanced in a good direction instead of just stagnating like it has previously. Tropico games usually have some DLC and expansion packs throughout their lifetime that bring even more new stuff to the table, and I'm excited to see just what Limbic will come up with for 6, and it's already in a pretty good spot. The only real disappointment I had with Tropico 6 is just how limited the customization has become. Customization was never super in-depth for the series, as its character creation has always been extremely basic, but the most interesting thing was how you could pick the traits of your avatar and had to balance the positives and negatives that went along with them. Tropico 5 cut things down to only having one trait to pick from, and sadly 6 keeps that. To make up for it, the game does let you change what that trait is on the fly, but it feels kind of like a cop-out to me. Deciding what the background of your El Presidente was and how different traits would affect different factions as well as your economy lent some nice strategy to the game overall. And since 6 uses a mission-by-mission structure, it could give you more variety in what you want to do when it comes to completing that mission. I do appreciate being able to change the traits without having to create a whole new character, but it just doesn't really seem to feel like it does enough to be all that interesting. Other than that, I can definitely say Tropico 6 is one of, if not my favorite entry in this series so far, as it really does a whole heck of a lot to take things forward without falling back on past problems. If you like city builders or management games in general, I can definitely give it a recommendation, as regardless of how you want to run your country, being a thriving Caribbean paradise or just sitting back and watching the world burn, I found it to be a viable time sink and just a good time in general. Thanks for watching. Please let me know what you think about the game or this video in the comment section. I'm Mega Pie Man, and I'll talk to you guys later.
The election is a landslide.
Want to see more quick peeks? Click on the video on the left for Debris, a first-person exploration game set below the Arctic Ocean. Or click on the video on the right for a look back at Metro 2033, a very Russian post-apocalyptic first-person shooter.